The deadlock is finally broken in what surely must be one of the tightest series we've seen in America's Cup. I want to say living history, maybe not living history, but certainly this century. Barely anything to split the teams on performance. I'm going to dive into that, show you where the kind of subtle differences are between the teams and some of the key points that we can take from the racing so far. To set the scene, INEOS have taken a 6-4 lead over the Italians. Ben exclaiming that was anything but lucky as he went over the line. Some comment in the press about INEOS's performance through the series and how they have maybe got lucky in some of the results. I don't think that at all. I don't think luck comes into these results, but I do think they have been gifted some wins by Luna Rossa's kind of poor boat prep, and I think it is right to acknowledge this. So when we talk about which boat is faster, I've talked a lot about INEOS's speed potential right from the start of this, and I think that's true, and we're still seeing glimmers of this in the data against Luna Rossa. But Luna Rossa as an overall racing package are hugely effective. The two helms work well together. I think one key point we've learned is how smooth Luna Rossa are on switching their power to different elements of the sail control and coordinating that with the helmsman who's doing the traveller control. And I do kind of feel that in these races in the top end, when this series started, we hadn't seen much racing in the top end. And I think INEOS's performance at the end of the round robins, where they started to come good in slightly increased breeze, kind of the 15 knot range, kind of 13 to 15, 16 knots. People thought that performance would extrapolate up to the top end breezes, and that's where they'd had an advantage over Luna Rossa. And we've seen that's not the case. They simply don't have a huge advantage. And actually, in many races, when INEOS have got behind, they have struggled to close the gap on Luna Rossa. And a lot of INEOS wins have come from failures on Luna Rossa's part. I'm not going to say that's luck, but it is failures on Luna Rossa's part. So if in an alternate universe, think if you look at INEOS's wins, race 2, fair win. Race 3, jib batten broke on Luna Rossa. Luna Rossa disqualified. That was a gimme. Race 5, Luna Rossa fell off the falls in the pre-start. And again, is this an unforced error or not? It's hard to call anything in a pre-start unforced. It's hugely pressurised. But it did give INEOS about an 85 metre head start. Luna Rossa clawed that race back to within touching distance and then fell away again. But again, it felt like it was more of a Luna Rossa error. And then race 7, we had the fairing fall off. But really before that, it was an issue with their cant drop. Something to do with the automated systems which link controls. And that prevented them putting for tacking when they wanted to. So then they came into the Lewin mark late. Did a Dino, which is a tack bear away, one of the hardest manoeuvres. And then stuffed it and the fairings came off and they lost that race. So at the end of race 8, you could arguably say if things had gone Luna Rossa's way, then they would have finished the series there. 7-1 victors. I don't think any of that's luck. And if we look deeper back in the series, we can see that Luna Rossa have had other issues with their boat. They had the cant system switching off. They had the systems shut down in the prelim. And then they had the traveller failure against American Magic in the semi. So all these issues are starting to accumulate and become more of a systemic trend for Luna Rossa, which is of genuine concern. INEOS, on the other hand, throughout the recon, they've had quite a few, or more than their fair share, of equipment failures, days off the water, frustrations with electronics, all this kind of stuff. And yet, since the racing starts, I think INEOS are the only team not to have any boat equipment issues at all, which is remarkable, especially as they've just got through 5 days of racing in top end conditions. So yeah, not luck at all, a well prepared boat. And on the switch of that, I'd also say INEOS's racing in these top end conditions has been a bit more conservative than Luna Rossa's. So INEOS have had a very marginal straight line speed advantage, but they've been very conservative in the bareways, often going 2 boards for longer until they get the catch on the new angle. Roundups, again, I think in the first 2 races when they got behind Luna Rossa, a lot of the reason INEOS were falling further back was that they were just more cautious in their pursuit, often choosing not to jibe to split the gate, but instead follow Luna Rossa around and then go into a JK, or actually follow for a while and then tack out. And all this led to INEOS struggling to close those gaps, whereas Luna Rossa were much hotter in pursuit. So, what do I think of the racing? Well, let's have a look at today's racing. 2 races INEOS had, and just have a quick look at the data. So, upwind VMGs, GBR on the left here, slightly better VMG than Luna Rossa in the first race. Now, this was the first time Luna Rossa got on the wrong jib. They were on a small jib. It was hell of wavy today, but it wasn't like top end conditions windy. It was kind of 19 knots most, but predominantly kind of 16, 17 knots. And yeah, that kind of hurt Luna Rossa's upwind speed. And you can see it was, for a bigger sail, because Luna Rossa, generally when you have a smaller sail, you don't point as high, but you go faster. And that's kind of what we see, like a faster boat speed upwind here, and apparent wind angle is actually tighter because of the speed, but the true wind angle, actually they're sailing further away from the breeze, true wind angle, than INEOS. So INEOS's advantage coming from pointing higher with a bigger jib, kind of screwing up into wind. And then because of the bigger jib, that really let INEOS loose on the downwinds. Much better VMG, better boat speed, obviously just more sail area and smaller foils, so all advantage to INEOS downwind in that first race. But again, like another fairly big mistake from Luna Rossa in this series on that jib call. Then we jump into the second race of the day, and upwind VMG, nothing between these 2 teams, both on the same jibs. INEOS going slightly faster and slightly lower true wind angle, but yeah, hardly anything in it at all. Leeway's very similar. But then INEOS relying on that downwind boat speed. But honestly, if they'd fell behind or significantly behind in these races, I know the second race they were behind for a moment before they got back ahead with a good tack. But I think if INEOS had fell behind in these races, they would have struggled. So the big win for INEOS was the start. So they had 2 starts that they won today, and 2 races that they won. I've said earlier in this video that possibly people thought extrapolating up INEOS's performance in the mid-range at the end of the round robins to more breeze, INEOS would be faster, and they've not been. Why have they not been? Why have INEOS has been struggling? Well, I'll just bring up this photo here. I think I think is a room for improvement on INEOS, and is actually just fantastically beautiful on Luna Rossa, is the sail shapes. So this is from yesterday in those top end conditions, and you'll see here INEOS in the bottom of their sail, especially below this clue attachment point here, have a bit of a belly developing into their sails. This was after the first clearing tack upwind. INEOS often generally on a smaller jib and a more powered up main, and I think that was putting more load on their rudder and causing them to be more cautious. I've spoke about already, going more 2 boards down more often, and I think they're just running out of depowering on these mains. The way the sail's bagging below this point suggests that to me. Luna Rossa, on the other hand, are able to get this really flat shape throughout the sail, and a better balance between the jib that lets them hold a larger jib further up into the range. So pretty incredible they're not on their smallest jib in what is right top end conditions. But what that does is it keeps the yaw balance, so the amount of load on the back of the boat, pushing the rudder and screwing the boat up into wind, versus the amount of load on the jib, which is bearing you away, and not great on INEOS. And I think they've probably targeted a lot of their improvements in the mid-range and the bottom range, and they've seen great steps forward there. But yeah, room for improvement, I feel, on the sail shaping of INEOS compared to Luna Rossa. It's a takeaway point they could have. Another thing we saw today, once we got into the waves, much bigger waves, slightly less breeze, but whilst INEOS isn't a hugely forgiving boat or Britannia's not a hugely forgiving boat at the top of the range, where they've got this skinny rudder and highly loaded mainsail, making them fear of losing the rudder in terms of turning the boat. What they do have in waves is a longer rudder, so they're less likely to lose the elevator grip, and the shape of their hull in the waves as well. Shape of their hull, they have this quite voluminous forward bustle, and what that does, if you can kind of think of it like a bike suspension that goes through the waves, it's quite a linear bike suspension, and then as it flares up, you have this strong progression to hold the bow out when it gets really sketchy. But it can do quite a lot of smashing through waves just riding on this quite voluminous bustle, and that has saved them a few times. We saw in the race today the splashdown they had out of the back of the jibe, quite incredible scenes, but again relying on that bustle just to get them out of issues in these waves where they lose the rudder. They can kind of let the bustle just keep the boat on the straight and narrow. We've heard Lee McMillan talk about this in the Inside Tack, I think. An amazing bit of skill. Like, this isn't luck at all, but the skill to get that board back down, get the sail plan balanced again, get the rudder kind of re-engaged, flow established again. All, they gave away quite a bit of distance, but for another boat without that same deep bustle, I think that would have been a skid out and all over. Hugely impressive, and definitely no luck involved there. That's all design and sailor skill. On paper, I don't see any reason or any evidence from their matchups in this series so far that would have me saying that Luna Rossa can't win 3 races. I do have this niggling feeling that as we go more into the mid-range, we're more hitting INEOS's sweet spot. I think INEOS have got a boat which struggles either end of that, although they were pretty good in the light in the race that got abandoned. But I think in that mid-range where you have an easterly swell, 10 to 15 knots, maybe a bit less, more kind of like 8, 9 to 14 knots, INEOS, the full package is more controllable in those lower wind speeds. The bustle is very good in the waves, and I think if we get those conditions, then I think Luna Rossa may be ruining their chances. We went through the list earlier of the kind of like failure points through the earlier rounds of these series, and I think INEOS may find that last race win rather easily in those wavier and lighter wind conditions. That's my gut feeling on it. Just big shout out to Alan, a long-term supporter of mine. They've been in this America's Cup supporting my YouTube thing since the very, very early days. Obviously, I use it across all my boats, and I wouldn't recommend it to you if I didn't really believe in the product. You can get 15% off, no catches, but 15% off with a code in the description. Please do use that. Please show Alan some love, and that's all I've got to say. That's it for me. We've got still potentially 2 more days sailing, but the next racing will be on Friday. 1 race to win it for INEOS, 3 races to win it for Luna Rossa, and we're going to get the conclusion very shortly of what has been one of the tightest matches in my living memory of the America's Cup, at least. So fantastic times for sport. That's everything for me. See you around.